Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to talk through the midterm test review for History of Philosophy. I'm using my new software here, my ScreenPal. I've used in the past Screenomatic, so this is a brand new one. Hopefully things are going to go well. Also, you're not going to see me because I don't want to have my face in the corner somewhere and you not be able to see the text on the screen. So let's just focus on my voice instead. So the midterm test review goes from modules 2 to module 7. And we started, of course, with the very first module where we basically asked ourselves, what is philosophy? Certainly go back and look at those slides again, but those are not going to be on the test. Instead, we're going to start with module 2 and ask ourselves, who were the ancient Greeks? And the ancient Greeks were individuals, philosophers and thinkers and writers and poets who basically tried to reinvent the way that they understood the world. Now, why is that important to us today in 2023? Well, because ancient Athenian culture offers us 5 different things. 1, it represents a starting point of Western civilization and the world of democratic thinking and democratic institutions, which leads to Western political and legal institutions. It creates a body of scientific, technical, and philosophical knowledge. It shows future civilizations, us, that the relationship between political freedom, technological advancements, and the exercise of reason was essential for the creation of knowledge. That's a really important one. Over and above all the others, the fact that you have to have political and cultural and academic freedom, technological advancements, and the use of reason. We need all of those tools in order to create new bodies of knowledge. And finally, the last one is the separation of reason from theological thinking, theological influences. At that time, it would have been mythology. And the way in which they did it was through a reinventing of the Greek alphabet. During the Dark Ages, everything was lost. Dark Ages being around 1200 BC. And what happens around 800 is through exchange with Judaic cultures and Egyptian cultures and other cultures which already had a written alphabet, the Greeks came up with their own. And it was basically a lot of sort of shorthanding of words and ideas. And that Greek alphabet became that revolutionary tool that allowed philosophy to essentially hit the ground running. So it was a written alphabet that converted speech or an oral culture into a written culture. And it converted this objective artifact, the word, into a language. And that language could now be read rather than having to be committed to memory. So mythology, mythological stories, epic poems, all of those were often committed to memory and recited by those individuals who had the capacity to remember an epic poem that could have gone for pages and pages had they been written down. So what happens is philosophy takes this tool and uses it in order to come up with ideas about the world that had nothing to do with mythology. The words didn't have to rhyme. There wasn't an interest or a concern with iambic pentameter, rhythm, structure. It was now a brand new literary condition. And literacy becomes again, a tool in and of itself that is defined by readers who are reading these texts. So the written word becomes a storage unit for thinking, much like your laptop becomes a storage unit, your hard drive for your ideas, your texts. And imagine that the computer is a kind of small word. Here, the word itself contains meaning. And meaning now does not have to be expressed in rhyme or in a poetic structure. It is a sentence. So the written language has the capacity now to speak about abstract things, ideas about thoughts, thoughts about thoughts. And it allows individuals to capture these abstract thoughts for the very first time. Now, the way in which this is done is through something called paideia. And paideia means lifelong learning in Greek. And education, self-improvement, social and cultural responsibility were all part of what made the polis, or the city-state, work. And if everyone was basically facing the same way, thinking the same way, and thinking collectively, the chances of the polis existing were that much stronger. So not only is language important, but thinking and expressing your ideas, persuading others of your ideas becomes very, very important. And because of that, when individuals are thinking about things, they're now orienting themselves towards ideals. And the realm that is created by paideia would have been the agora, right, or the marketplace where people discuss these ideas. The paideia represents this notion of critical self-reflection, and that degree of self-reflection is paramount in the development of political institutions, very early forms of democracy. Now remember, democracy at this point is only landed males. Women, children, migrant workers, slaves, anyone that's sort of traveling through that city, they don't really have a say in what's going on. But we have to remember that at least the seed, the germ of democracy starts at this early point. Now, one of the ways in which paideia is able to explain to the individuals, the Greek citizens, or the Athenian citizens in this case, was through storytelling. And one of the ways in which they did it was through tragedy. So the relationship between tragedy and ethical life becomes very important. And tragedy is a way in which individuals think about not only themselves, but their relationship to others. And if you make a wrong move and you don't think through your actions, you could end up in a tragic situation. So now all of a sudden, tragedy is about gluing together that social collective. And tragedy explains and expresses and shows and describes when someone makes the wrong decision, or when the audience knows the right answer. And very good playwrights would point these things out quite early on, and they would see how the main characters would make mistakes. They would make missteps. They would be filled with pride, a kind of hubris that could be quite dangerous at times. And no big surprise, but Greek tragedies at the time were often written by lawyers, right? Early forms of lawyers who would, in a sense, work out like a kind of a thought experiment. What if? What if a character knew this particular thing, or everyone else around them did, but they did not? And it could be anything. Any kind of situation that might threaten the social collective was considered a potential tragedy. So whatever important legal issues of the day were discussed, that's when they were discussed within the confines of tragedy. So tragic drama was a way in which that collective political institution operating within the Athenian polis could work out these limitations, and understanding that there are limits to what the individual can think, say, and do. And in a sense, they are cautionary tales, because what they were cautioning against was hubris, pride, right? It's my way or the doorway. And that becomes very, very dangerous, because at this same time, the ancient Athenians were now completely responsible for their own choices. As much as the gods and goddesses were still around, the individuals, the citizens of the polis, were responsible for their actions. So this becomes at times quite overbearing, and individuals don't know what to do. So to be given cautionary tales at least allows them to orient themselves around likely the right answer, the right action, right? Because a misstep could bring great tragedy upon you and upon your family. Now, why is this important? Well, because this kind of thinking and this constant sort of resetting of philosophy back to its point of origin, which is ancient Athens, ends up having more and more of an influence on French and German thought in the 18th and 19th centuries. We know during the French Revolution, Aristotelian virtues had been really paramount in describing and defining what would make a good community, one that was equated with harmony, integrity, justice. Now, justice is in balance, not justice is in fairness, equality, frugality, friendship, all of these things that those individuals that were thinking about a good social community wished to make sure remained intact and were celebrated. And so all of those things are good, but what was missing during the 18th and 19th centuries regarding the ancient world was that critical self-reflection that the Athenians told us to engage in, but the French, partly, and the Germans as well, instead uncritically accepted this myth of antiquity, this notion that the Greeks were fantastic in every way possible, and they weren't. They was a slave state. It was an imperialistic state, constantly trying to conquer everything around it. And it finally fell apart because it couldn't maintain this kind of aggressive, sort of outwardly reaching sort of decision to constantly conquer new lands. It literally broke at the center. So the French uncritically accept this very positive, rose-tinted view of the myth of antiquity. And they also lost sight of the fact that mythical thinking and myths embody human aspirations that never get realized. We aim for them, they are ideals, but we're always frustrated by the fact we fall short. And that becomes a way of thinking that by the mid-1900s, right, the 20th century, becomes extremely dangerous. So German intellectuals were very passionate about the notion of ideas and ideals, and they also, just like the ancient Greeks, tried to transform them into reality, for better or worse. And ideals are exactly that. They're unconditioned realities, and the way in which they were presented and understood was utterly detached from cultural, social, and natural environments. The idea was everything, and German intellectuals, perhaps more so than the French, slavishly sort of enamored these ideas, or were enamored by them. And the tragic achievements, the catastrophic failures, the dangers in political history, all of these things were ignored or sidestepped in favor of a kind of idealism that eventually became very dangerous, which is Nazism, the final solution. And even Germans, much like the ancient Athenians, had a sense of Bildung, right? Self-cultivation, very similar to paideia. And this is one that should have caused cooler heads to prevail. And instead, even individuals like Nietzsche, as much as he warned us that we cannot transplant mythology or culture from one place to another, different time, different place, even warned us, but even he fell under the sway of the Übermensch, right, the Superman, as a kind of end goal in human culture. And that kind of uncritical thinking we can see in Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch, because eventually it leads to Nazism. Okay, so that was Module 2, a 2,500-year visit to ancient Greece and then the 18th and 19th centuries. In Module 2, we talk about Pre-Socratic thinkers, and again, we have to sort of put them in the context of new ways of understanding the universe and the cosmos and our relationship to each other, to nature, using reason rather than mythology. We have, as we mentioned earlier, the written alphabet. There's the model of the city-state, the application of reason to just a general understanding of the world. Now, the written alphabet, to the pre-Socratics as well as those later, led to a standardization and publication of laws. That led to the development of the city-state, a more cohesive one, in which people knew clearly what needed to be done. There were legal codes that were drawn up by individuals, and because of the ability to use reason, the written alphabet, and again, freedom, right, intellectual freedom, what this leads to, for the first time in human history, is communities of men, unfortunately only men, who were regulated by impartial laws that they themselves chose and followed. So if they decided to renege on a particular law, if they wished to do away with it and bring in something else, then they could, because they would sit in the agora and would talk about what would be the best way going forward. And each of them using reason, using persuasive powers and rhetorical powers to convince each other that this was the best way going forward. Not by themselves, but together as a community. So, communities of men regulated by impartial laws that they themselves have created and chosen. And yes, it may not be democracy in the modern sense, but it certainly is a self-created beginning that we can look at. So the Pre-Socratics, which is the focus of this module, they reject traditional explanations and are more in favor of rational explanations using reason. They ask very deep questions about the essence of things, about a singular essential ingredient. Thales would talk about water, anaximeter, anaximander. All of these sort of monistic thinkers all ask generally the same questions. Where do things come from? How are they created? How can we explain the plurality of things found in nature? Can we describe nature using laws or using mathematics or geometry? So pre-Socratic thinkers used all of the tools that we've just described in 4 key areas of philosophical inquiry: being in the cosmos, right, or ontology and cosmology, the primary stuff of the universe, right, those essential single things like water or the epeiron or air or fire when we talk about Heraclitus, underlying principles. Now, this is, again, the beginnings of metaphysical thinking. The pre-Socratics would look at the world and try to think about what lay behind it and beyond it. So we start thinking for the first time about underlying principles, things we don't see but can be measured. So perceptible phenomena, human knowledge, morality, all of these various brand new ideas and concepts and formulas about the world are introduced here for the first time. And none of them, as you can imagine, exist in mythology, which is why mythology becomes less and less useful. So what's remarkable in this kind of early Greek and Athenian thinking, because now it's Greek in a general sense, because these pre-Socratics don't come from what was later known as the country of Greece, but actually to the coast, the Asian coast. So scientific thinking tried to look at sort of 3 main areas, or at least used ideas from those 3 main areas: algebra, physical measurements, astronomy, so looking at cosmological issues, the orbs, gravitational pull, and then finally nature, right, physical matter, earth, air, fire, water, the epeiron, right, that life force. Now, each of these individuals were considered monists, so believers in a single primary substance. And so as complex and as differentiated as the world was, and they identified individual parts, they all tried to subsume it into one single monistic thing, a primary substance, an essence. And the question becomes, well, how do these things work? How do these monistic little aspects, water and air and so on, how do they work? And so as they work through these ideas about these primary substances, they were led to question the idea of becoming and being and change, illusory change, actual change, existence with ongoing change. So as much as the world seemed to be stable before their eyes, the more they thought about the world, the more unstable it was becoming. And of course, it was unstable because of what lay behind it. So as I mentioned, we have different individuals who are all, again, monistic thinkers. Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes were very much concerned with the idea of becoming and how one substance changes into a different one. Heraclitus took that idea even further and said that, look, not only is the notion of becoming important, that's all reality is. Unending change, constant change. Parmenides, writing roughly about the same time, says, no, Heraclitus' claim of becoming is wrong. Change is an illusion. Only being exists because it is independent of time. This is an idea that Plato will pick up much later. And then finally, as you can imagine, lots of confusion with people that are trying to keep up to all these different arguments. There is change, there is no change, there's one thing, there's many things. As you can imagine, after all of that, along come other thinkers such as Empedocles, Anaxagoras, Democritus, who try to bring together the idea of plurality and ongoing change and say that, look, generally speaking, there are probably 4 main generic substances, not one: earth, air, fire, and water. And Democritus goes even further. He says all of these things, because he was a bit of a monistic thinker, says all of these things are the result of one thing: atoms. Just atoms. And of course, this is an individual that did not have a telescope, microscope, or anything, and yet came up with the idea that the world is made up of atoms of different sizes and shapes, and as a result, we can now understand how the world was put together, however temporary it may have been. So that is a very brief overview of the Pre-Socratics. Now on to Module 4, Plato the Idealist, and that is a comparison to Aristotle the Materialist, or the Empiricist. Now, Plato is known for many different accomplishments. Again, I'm not expecting you to know every single one of these or to remember them, but generally speaking, this is more an indication of his importance. He founded the Idealist school of philosophy, or metaphysics, laid the foundation for Western spirituality. Many of his ideas about metaphysics and his theory of forms were grafted on rather nicely to early Western spirituality, early Christian thought in particular. Was the innovator of the dialogue or dialectical forms of philosophy, this notion of truth by consensus. Now, why is that important? Because through consensus, we can all together agree that something is true. Now, that is quite the opposite than the tragic hero, right? The individual hero filled with pride and hubris. It's my way, the doorway. I know better. Philosophy, and Plato says, no, we need to agree together. We need to hear our differences and find that common ground. So one of the tools that Plato gives us that is specific to him is this kind of dialogical or dialectical form of thinking. Philosophy in his hands becomes a critical, rigorous, and systematic examination of all kinds of different issues. Now, because he came from an aristocratic and influential family, he was not a huge fan of the demos, right? As in the word democracy, the common people. Plato believed that only certain people could attain knowledge. He believed that knowledge is a matter of recollection. All these things that we are learning and discovering for the first time have always been there, right? They've been put in there by the gods, by divine insight. It's not learned empirically through observation. It's there. It's for us to dig within oneself through reason and idealist thinking to discover them. Because of that, he denied the reality, or at least he said the temporary reality of the material world. And for him, the truer, and the more real and the truer world was the world of ideas, because it was ahistorical, it was eternal, they were forever unchanging, that nothing changed in the world of ideas. So his theory of forms and ideas referred to his belief in the material world is not the real world, but only a copy, an inferior copy, a copy of the world that is corrupted, that dies away. It's never stable. And if we're going to talk about things that are eternal, clearly you want something that is stable. And for him, the idea, right? Not ideals necessarily, but the idea with a capital I. His theory of forms. Forms regarding beauty and justice and truth and all the ideas that we see expressed in the world, but we can't grasp these particular ideas and say, this is truth. Well, it's an expression or an example of truth, but the question still is, what is truth? And therein lies the interest and the importance of Plato's work, giving us the ability to describe things which are intangible. And of course, with a written language, that becomes even more or even easier, because we don't have to worry about poetry and making sure that our words rhyme. We can now look into the beyond. We can think metaphysically. We can move upward from the material world into the world of perfection, or what Plato thought was the perfect beauty of truth, the perfect form of truth, of justice. Now, what is really odd about Plato is the fact that he actually didn't trust that written language. He distrusted books, or distrusted, that's a hard word to say, because we couldn't question them. They were essentially done. And ideas were closed to correction, or discussion, or refinement. And ultimately, he says, no, books weaken the memory because we're simply reading about stuff. We're not experiencing it. We're not reflecting on it. And instead, all dialogues that he wrote and all dialogues that we should have with others should always be directed towards pure thoughts. And that's surprising because many of Plato's texts are written in the form of dialogues, so that for him, this was a compromise. A distrust of books and the written word in favor of the living spoken word. So he thought, well, why don't I just write my books in the form of dialogues so that we can see how the thought process is played out. So it's like showing someone a rough copy of an essay and saying, see, this is how I worked out my idea. Plato thought, why not make that the essence of the text? So these dialogues would be different characters, quite often Socrates, working through ideas regarding truth, beauty, justice. And as a result, we can see how these thinkers arrive at a consensus of one sort or another on what it is that they're talking about, truth and beauty and so on. So for Plato, truth is that solid, ahistorical, eternal thing that lies beyond that shifting, changing material world that unfortunately we are living in. But Plato thought, okay, we can still get there. We can still move on and be able to grasp something that is eternal. So as you can imagine, this is a very high standard that individuals need to live under and within. And one of Plato's most famous books, The Republic, is an attempt at trying to map out what this would look like, the city in which this kind of thinking and these kinds of citizens would live in. And here, political philosophy is not guided by interaction between individuals, communities. No, instead it's guided by geometry, by justice, by balance, by proportion. And clearly, as you can imagine, this is not the way that a society works. Societies are fluid, alive, creations, constantly changing, constantly in a state of flux. And Plato says, no, we can use geometry and balance to create this perfect world, which may last about one day. So when Plato talks about democracy, it's a very false image. There is this notion of a communal property. All of these things have been borrowed from different left and right wing political entities and moved in different ways. But ultimately, what Plato's trying to do is to manipulate the evolution of history rather than allowing it to unfold on its own and tweaking it here and there. He's trying to do a radical shift in one direction or the other. Now, Plato is neither a fascist nor a communist, but there certainly are ideas. There are ideas in his writings that appeal to both of those fields. But it is this notion of manipulating the development or the evolution of history that really makes his work both interesting and at times somewhat dangerous. So we ask ourselves, is Plato a kind of misguided idealist? Does he slavishly go after this ideal that he thinks can be brought down to the world, into the material world? Short answer is yes. Now, The Statesman is one of the last books that he wrote. Compared to Laws and the Republic, it's a book that is a little bit more practical. There's lots of digressions, but ultimately The Statesman is viewed, or the metaphor is of a weaver, a royal weaver, weaves together the arts that are necessary for the life of the city. So The Statesman weaves together the various components of virtue and justice and thought and perfections of one sort or another. And that's about the closest he gets to achieving some practical version of the Republic. The Laws goes even further. It is basically just a massive code book that has to do with the citizen, the foreigner, the slave. Nobody escapes the viewpoint or the worldview of Plato in the Laws. It basically is a law book, and it's regarding and discussing good and bad laws, what type of laws are good for a constitution. The rule of law is an expression of a true opinion. The notion of the rule of law is something that is very much alive and well in any republic. That is what a republic is, right? It's a republic based on the rule of law. No one is above the law. The focus is on law rather than sacred foundations. They're more secular. But here, finally, we have something where the government is almost democratic, but not quite. But at least we're moving in the right direction, because for Plato, again, we either have a philosopher king, or we have a royal weaver, and finally, he not is ready to give up, but decides, okay, let's at least present to ourselves what is going to work. And what is going to work is a body of codes, a body of laws. Okay, on to Module 5, Aristotle. And Aristotle is also known for many of his own accomplishments. He creates a comprehensive system of Western philosophy that includes metaphysics, logic, ethics, rhetoric, a whole range of things. Influenced medieval scholars and former logicians much later. Influenced theological thought during the early Middle Ages. In fact, it was Islamic scholars who actually salvaged Aristotle from the dustbin of history by translating his work into Arabic, and then through cultural and political exchanges between the Middle East and Western Europe, the Western European philosophers rediscovered Aristotle through the work of the Islamic scholars. One of the main differences between Plato and Aristotle is that Aristotle finds that universal not somewhere else in the world or in our minds, but actually the essence of things. He proposed this fifth element in ether, something like a divine substance from the heavenly bodies. Not an idea that people have really followed through a whole lot, but certainly elements of earth, air, fire, and water. It was correct. The notion of the essence of things, for example, the dogness of a chihuahua or beagle or poodle, right? The idea of dogness, right? The essence of dog is right there in front of us. And then, of course, we go from that to, warm-blooded mammal, animal, and on we go. But it's always within the thing itself. Notions of coming into being, various types of causal factors, a material cause, a formal cause, an efficient cause, a final cause. He defined metaphysics, right, as the knowledge of immaterial being and immaterial things. This is the continuation of Plato's work, but a much more detailed understanding of metaphysics, much closer to what we understand metaphysics to be today. Again, unlike Plato, he argued that there are no universals that are not also attached to existing things. Universals and the essence of something is in the thing itself, not separate and detached. The last two, ethics, which is something that Plato doesn't discuss a whole lot in his work. For Aristotle, it was very important because as a community-minded person, he believed that ethics was a practical rather than a theoretical study or theoretical field. And finally, considered the polis as a natural community and man as a political animal. Today, we might say a social animal, but at the time that Aristotle was writing, society as we know it today didn't exist. There was the family/economy, because wherever you lived, that was where you made your money. And the only other aspect of the world was the state. Now, the state in an informal sense, the laws and regulations that people had to follow, the particular leaders, whether they were aristocratic, monarchical, and so on. But Aristotle is saying that human beings, right, individuals are essentially social animals. So although he calls it political, that's essentially what he's saying. People like to live together. That's essentially what he's saying. So Aristotle was a physicist. He wasn't just a philosopher. So as a physicist, he understood the world, and he tried to distinguish between the sciences and other mental activities like logic and metaphysics. He thought that politics was an aspect of ethics because it couldn't be reduced to these Platonic, ideals and eternal and fixed systems, because ethics would change over time. The notion of virtue didn't, but the notion of ethics certainly would have changed. And his own book, Politics, not like the abstract utopian republic of Plato, but Aristotle's Politics is grounded in very real and at that time existing and real political institutions, unfortunately including slavery. But he does discuss them in that book. So by doing so, he rejects Plato's ideas of forms in favor of empirical thinking and empiricism. Empiricism being knowledge from sense experience. Now, the difference between Aristotle here and empirical thinkers around, say, the 1500s and 1600s is it's a combination of empirical thinking, but also testing, scientific testing, so that you can formulate an idea, right, a concept, or formulate an idea about something through constant testing and retesting. But at this point, it is at least the beginnings of empirical thinking, deriving knowledge from the senses. Aristotle's greatest contribution was to biology. He applied a biological model to the understanding of human beings, how individuals wish to come together. And of course, one of the most important aspects and almost central in the Athenian world was not only the union of a man and woman, but the resulting family, right? Because the resulting family also becomes the foundation of their economic structure. And of course, being biologically minded, Aristotle looks at the unequal social, political, and economic relations as somehow natural. It is just the way it is. And Aristotle, unfortunately, argues that women, as well as slaves, are biologically predisposed to be ruled over, which is really sad and unfortunate because of the fact that the Greeks, in general, the Athenians in particular, often would conquer other lands and enslave people. So how can you say that someone is biologically preconditioned or predisposed to be ruled over when most of the slaves that were working, and at least were there in Athens, were captured soldiers, captured women and children? So it doesn't work out so well. Okay, so Aristotle uses the biological paradigms rather than historical ones because, well, Aristotle was not really interested in history and historians, because this was a field that was just beginning at this point. And he says, look, ancient philosophers weren't impressed by what historians had to say because for Aristotle, history focused too much on particularities, right, rather than universal themes, which is an odd statement to make because the development of history is a development of changes over time. So to talk about universal themes makes him sound almost more Platonic than Aristotelian. But that was the way he saw the world. Aristotle was writing also at the time that the classical polis was dying, and so it threw into question the idea of what is a citizen, and what is a citizen became something that really concerned individuals, because without a polis to identify with, right, because to be an Athenian was part of one's essence, part of one's identity. Now all of a sudden there was a search for a wisdom and moral existence, ethical behavior that concentrated not on the community, but on the individual. So in this new world, Aristotle tried to apply logic and biological formulas to come up with the practical applications of the citizen living in what was now the extinct polis. So if that were the case, the one thing that Aristotle left behind that still applies even today was the work that he did in the Nicomachean Ethics, and in particular talking about virtue, because virtue is something that could be applied literally anywhere. It didn't matter where you lived. And so in the Nicomachean Ethics, the central question here is the character of individuals. And he believed that the activity of the soul in conformity with virtues, courage, generosity, self-control, temperance, all of these good qualities in a person is what makes a good citizen, a good individual, a good subject. So these are commendable traits that we ought to have, or at least aspire to, but also manifested in habitual actions. In other words, I'm not going to be a courageous or generous person periodically or occasionally, or if I think it might be a good thing, I do it all the time. So there's a degree of consistency and predictability in the behavior of a person that makes them virtuous. So courage, generosity, and self-control are done continually, and these become the essence of the person. So instead of I am an Athenian, I am a courageous person. I am a generous person, regardless of where I'm from. So the notion of virtues is a very important one for Aristotle, because without having to rely on the notion of where someone is born, it's instead the way they behave, which is not a bad idea. Okay, at this point, Module 6, we jump ahead to the Enlightenment, Descartes, Francis Bacon, Galileo. And here we jump about, well, almost 1,500 years, because in between, it's really sort of medieval theologians who are using philosophy to support Christianity and religious thought. And anything that was done other than that, we either don't know about or had been shut down. So philosophy serves a secondary purpose. It serves to support the church. And it's not until this period of time, just around the Renaissance and the Baroque era, the 1400s, 1500s, that we start seeing a real change. And one of the major changes is a view of the world as mechanistic, right? A mechanistic world of geometric bodies, atoms in motion. New mathematical tools and scientific methods are being used to grasp an understanding of the world. And the idea of a world of atoms governed by these mechanistic laws of motion became the way in which these individuals understood the laws that were occurring behind the physical world that we could see. So like the Pre-Socratics, they're looking at what's going on behind the physical world. And it was, generally speaking, atoms moved by mechanistic laws of motion. One of the first individuals, René Descartes, is considered the father of modern philosophy. He sets out to try to prove beyond a reasonable doubt some kind of foundational statement. Right? He wants to set or establish a set of principles that can be truly known without any shred of doubt. And he does this by applying this tool called skepticism. It's a critical tool that allows us to strip away everything that could be doubted. So skepticism here is a type of inquiry that allows us to be cautious and be intellectually rigorous. It's 2, a way of gathering knowledge. 3, a set of claims about the limits of human knowledge. And all 3 of those, a type of inquiry, a way of gathering knowledge through systematic doubt, and a set of claims about the limits to which we can know something, all work together to create what would have been a methodological skepticism. And Descartes arrives at this single fundamental principle that thought exists, no matter what. Even if I am doubting and stripping away the world as I know it, I am still thinking. So I think, therefore I am, is one of the famous statements by Descartes, perhaps one of the few that most people know, but that's what it means. I think, right, no matter what, I can doubt everything else, but I'm thinking. Therefore, if I am, I must exist. So Descartes concludes that something, his mind or someone, himself is doing the doubting. But to doubt is still to think. So the very fact that he can doubt gives way to the approving of his own existence. Now, this kind of thinking became known as Continental Rationalism. Now, rationalism was previously attributed to Plato, but here it becomes continental because it is something that is specific to Western Europe. So Continental Rationalism, it's a branch of Western philosophy that looks at human reason as the absolute foundation of the natural sciences. Reason becomes a chief source and measure of all things. Truth cannot be discovered through the senses because, just like Plato said, where it's corruptible, the real world is corruptible, our senses can be corrupted. So truth cannot be discovered through the senses because we can be tricked, but only through intellectual deduction, stripping away to that final one essential thing, that thought exists. And so with this methodological doubt and skepticism, the first thing that Descartes does is he proves the existence of God, and in so doing is able to say, well, I can believe that the world exists because why would God, fool me or cause doubt in me? So if I can think of a perfect being such as God who would not trick me or conceive of a world that doesn't exist, then I can say that the world exists because I can think of it. So the existence of God, the nature of truth, and so on, all of these done through a form of intellectual deduction that is primarily motivated by skepticism. Now, around the same time, in England is Francis Bacon, who does not use the deductive method, but the inductive method. And this is what it is. This scientific method is one in which he looks at as many different possible permutations of whatever it is that he's studying. And through inductive reasoning, careful observation, we are able now to make just the most conditional claims. All swans are white. Okay, every single swan I've ever seen in my entire life has always been white. So I'm going to hazard a guess that inductively, because I have looked at every example I have, inductively speaking, I can empirically say that all swans are white because I have seen nothing but that. So I'm going to make a hypothetical or tentative statement that says that all swans are white because I induced that particular observation. Now, for Bacon, the focus is always on a combination of experimental research and observation. And so by doing this, Bacon now avoids the issue that we have had up until this point where our senses may deceive us. By continual experimenting, observation, testing, more research, more observation, we can counteract the natural tendencies towards biases or weaknesses that we have in our own minds. And this is how he does it, through constant testing and retesting. Galileo is the last person we're going to look at. He's considered the father of observational astronomy and cosmology, the father of modern physics, father of modern science. Galileo's main claim or his place in history is his belief in heliocentrism. And this is the idea that the Earth and the planets revolve around the sun, which is the center of the solar system. And that idea was very controversial at the time because scientists and the church believed instead in geocentrism, in which the Earth is at the center of all the celestial bodies. And this is partly coming from the Bible because there are statements in the Bible that imply that the Earth is the center of all things. Therefore, you'd think, well, what would that look like? I think it means that the Earth doesn't move. It's right here. Everything else moves around it. We're the center, the eye of the storm. So Galileo tried to defend heliocentrism based on his own observations as early or in the early 1600s. And he argued and said, no, it's not contrary to biblical texts, but the Bible is an authority on faith, ethics, morality, but not on science. And as you can imagine, the response was rather harsh by the church. He was tried by the Roman Inquisition. He was found to be vehemently suspect of heresy and forced to recant his observations, and he spent the rest of his life under house arrest. But we know that this is what he did, and no big surprise, shortly after Galileo died, all of the supposedly heretical statements that he made were quietly brought back into science, and all the books that had been sitting on the index of banned books all quietly came back. And the behavior was like, well, he was right all along. And no other discussion was made about the fact that his thoughts were heretical. So thankfully, the books are still around. And finally, the last one is Module 7, Social Contract Theories. I know I've been going for 3/4 of an hour. We looked at a lot of stuff here. Okay, social contract theories. I always like to start with an explanation of what is it we're talking about. What is a social contract? It's a voluntary, legally consensual argument amongst individuals that brings society into being. And that contract, or those contracts, depending on who you believe, are invested with the rights to secure mutual protection and welfare, as well as to regulate the legal relations among its members. So all three contracts that we look at focus on these things. Where they differ is the degree of power that the state has. So in the case of Hobbes, because he lived through a civil war, he wanted to make sure that whatever he was going to conjure up as a force of political will, it was going to be absolute and it would last forever. And this is why he thought the monarchy was the better way to go. Now, as a kind of quasi-psychologist, he also understood that individuals had a drive for self-preservation, and if you could convince them of that, they'd be more likely to transfer some of that rights, or some of the rights that they had in the state of nature, to protect themselves, to go out and achieve vengeance, or to attack someone else because they themselves have been attacked. All these things because it's a drive for self-preservation. If he can come up with a mechanistic model, the likelihood is these individuals will say, yes, okay. So Hobbes says, all right, in my social contract, the first foundation of natural right is the ability to protect one's life and property. Otherwise, it's a state of nature. It's a state of war of all against all. And life is nasty, brutish, and short. So Hobbes not only knew that individuals had a drive for self-preservation, He also knew that they were afraid of violent death. And all of this is sort of deep fried in us being egotistical beings. And by appealing to all of these aspects, these psychological aspects of ourselves, he thought, okay, if I can create laws of nature, or at least derive from the state of nature these particular laws, then that will be how I'm going to sell this idea. So Hobbes says, okay, peace should be sought after as much as possible. The rights of all individuals to all things should be abolished. We can't just randomly grab each other's stuff, or at least relinquish to some degree. And if we can do that, individuals will now come together, transfer some of those rights for retaliation and vengeance to a common power, an absolute power. And all of that behavior becomes what is called a social contract. Individuals, if they stay in the state of nature, will be miserable. Yes, they have absolute freedom, but that means everyone has absolute freedom. And as a result, it becomes extremely dangerous. So that's Hobbes. The second one we look at is John Locke, whose version of the social contract is much more civilized. It's based, again, also on natural laws of life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And what happens with Locke is he looks at what was in the state of nature and transfers them over into rights. So we have a social right, right? It becomes a positive right. So it's posited by individuals, posited into a law that we follow. And if we can do that, and we can take the best of the state of nature, freedom, liberty, pursuit of happiness, all the good things, let's entrench them in law and have a legal system protect it. Sounds reasonable. And that's literally what Locke does and creates liberal democracy in the process. So Locke thinks that entering into a social contract is entirely reasonable, it's natural, it's an evolutionary step. Think of Plato trying to radically shift the movement of history, right, through revolution. Locke says, no, doing this is a natural evolutionary step in the development of mankind and humankind. So political power in this particular context is the right of making laws, including the penalty of death, the regulation or preservation of property, the employment of force in the community to make sure that people do behave before the law, and that all power and judicial jurisdictions are reciprocal. So it is one in which we subject ourselves to the law, but we can also question that law and change it. So individuals do not have the rights entrenched and protected by law. They're merely equal under the law. So whatever offenses we are dealing with, we want to make sure that we are protected and as subjects and under the law, that we are treated equally, equal representation, equal access to the courts and so on. So we don't necessarily have rights per se entrenched, but we at least have equality before the law. So just because someone is rich, allegedly, they should be treated just the same as someone who may not be able to afford such a good lawyer. As you can imagine, there have been deviations from that. These are ideals, not realities. Retribution is still something that is or was an issue, a problem in the state of nature, brought into the social contract, and retribution is now done on behalf of the individual through the state, right? So the way in which we seek vengeance is not by attacking someone, but perhaps by suing someone or by asking the legal system to charge someone. So retribution here is the only time when one person might wish to harm another because of a particular action or behavior or punishment, libel or slander, theft, any of these things. And Locke thought that, okay, if that's the case, then we need to have a system that is both empirical, you can observe the law in action, and also rational, because it's derived from reason. Everyone is treated equally under the law. So this was the way in which Locke was able to create a social contract that was mechanistic. It had a cause and effect relationship between one's actions and the consequences that result. That was the kind of causal, mechanistic or mechanical view of the world that we see in Locke's work. Now, the last person is Rousseau. who followed very much Locke's political writings, writing in the 1760s, 1770s. His writings actually influenced the French Revolution. So indirectly Locke and directly Rousseau. The French Revolution ended up using Rousseau's theory of the social contract to create the rights of individuals. So on the other side of the revolution were many of the ideas originally presented by Rousseau in his work prior to the revolution. And again, the same sort of metaphoric state of nature and complete freedom. We're not subject to authority. Self-preservation was good. But with Rousseau, there is a very important difference and a real stress, unlike Hobbes, absolutely, and a little bit like Locke. Rousseau was very concerned with the amount of force that a government could inflict upon its people. And he said, force does not give a government moral authority. He's writing at a time when the church and the monarchy are intertwined very deeply and very intimately in lording over individuals, the French individuals. And so what was of great concern to Rousseau was the degree of force, the amount of force that a government would inflict upon its people. And he said the more force there is, the more immoral they become. Because to yield to force is an act of necessity, not of free will or choice. If citizens obey by force, then they're not obeying out of duty or out of any kind of sort of ethical dimension, but just out of fear. And so to run a government this way is absolutely incorrect. And the French population at that time, prior to the revolution, knew exactly what he was saying. They understood what he was saying. So the social contract that is mapped out by Rousseau creates what's called the body politic. The body politic are all the individual citizens and subjects of that community that become a sovereign. Their sovereign considered a state, and members become citizens under the state, subjects under the law, with restrictions, not to come and go, but restrictions against theft or against murder, against harming others. And then finally, the sovereign, right, as that body politic. So a sovereign, a body politic, a community, group of people, those are all essentially the same thing, right? They're all different words, but the same idea. And Rousseau says that sovereign, right, that body politic, is allowed to use a certain degree of force, what he called the general will, that ensures that individuals follow what the community wish to follow through with. So the general will is this paradoxical idea that individuals will be forced to be free. And that is literally what he says in the book. So it's not contradictory, it's very paradoxical. So whatever the body politic believe is in its own best interest, those who don't think that are going to be forced to go along with it through the general will. Okay, so sorry that almost took an hour. A lot of material. Hopefully some of these things are clear in your mind, because I know I did make the video lectures, but the test you'll have is online. It'll be open for the next couple of weeks. It'll go right through the break, not this coming week, but the week after. But I'm going to open it up as of today, which is the 11th, Sunday, and I'll leave it open right till I believe the 25th. So lots of time. If you are writing it, you will open it and you'll have 2 hours to complete it. If you are an accommodation student, you will have extra time. Then I will set up. You don't need to contact me, but I will set this up and it'll be available for you to complete over the next 2.5 weeks. So good luck. Hopefully you do well, and hopefully this has helped you out in at least clarifying some ideas. And I'm going to do the same thing in the second half of the course and give you an overview of the second half, because the final exam only looks at modules 8 to 13. So the first test, the midterm, is 2 to 7, and the rest is between 8 to 13. So best of luck, and we'll talk soon. Bye-bye.